What relative's weight gain turned out to be evidence of something much darker? My cousin Autumn gained 80 pounds in 6 months while living with our aunt and uncle, and nobody in the family questioned it until I showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning in October and saw what they'd done to her. Autumn had always been athletic and health conscious, running track in high school and eating carefully because she had family history of diabetes. When I last saw her at Christmas, she weighed maybe 130 pounds and could run a 5K without breaking a sweat. Now she sat slumped on the living room couch in stained sweatpants, her face bloated and expressionless, her body transformed into something unrecognizable. She looked at me without apparent recognition when I said her name, her eyes glassy and unfocused behind puffy eyelids. My Aunt Diane rushed into the room and positioned herself between us, explaining too quickly that Autumn was going through depression and the medication made her gain weight. She said this casually, smiling that tight smile she used when lying, and I knew immediately something was profoundly wrong. I'd driven 4 hours from my apartment in the city to visit Autumn because she hadn't returned my calls in 3 months. We'd always been close, more like sisters than cousins, and her sudden silence felt alarming. My mother told me not to worry, that Autumn was just adjusting to living with Diane and Gerald while she attended community college nearby. But Autumn had texted me religiously every few days since middle school, sharing memes and complaining about assignments and telling me about her life in paragraph-long messages. The silence was completely out of character. When I finally texted Diane directly asking to visit, she responded after 2 days saying Autumn was busy with school and maybe another time. That response made me get in my car and drive without calling ahead. I arrived at their large colonial house in the suburbs at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, letting myself through the unlocked front door and calling Autumn's name. That's when I found her on the couch, barely responsive, transformed beyond recognition. Diane kept talking in that artificially cheerful voice, explaining how Autumn had struggled with the transition to college life, how she'd developed anxiety and depression, how the psychiatrist prescribed medication that unfortunately caused weight gain as a side effect. Gerald appeared in the doorway behind Diane, arms crossed over his expensive polo shirt, watching me with cold calculation. I ignored them both and knelt in front of Autumn, taking her hand. Her fingers felt swollen and clammy, and she didn't squeeze back when I pressed. I asked her directly if she was okay, if she wanted to talk to me. Autumn's mouth opened slightly, her tongue moving slowly behind her teeth, but no words came out. She seemed to be trying to focus on my face but couldn't quite manage it. Diane put her hand on my shoulder and firmly suggested we talk in the kitchen, away from Autumn, who needed to rest. I stood reluctantly, following Diane while glancing back at my cousin, who'd already slumped sideways against the couch cushions. In the kitchen, Diane poured coffee I didn't want and launched into elaborate explanations about Autumn's mental health crisis. She described panic attacks and crying episodes and missed classes and appointments with therapists who prescribed various medications. She pulled out a pill organizer with 7 compartments showing different colored capsules and tablets, pointing to each one and rattling off names I didn't recognize. She explained how hard it had been watching Autumn struggle, how grateful she was they could provide support during this difficult time, how the doctors promised the depression would improve once they found the right medication balance. Gerald nodded along, adding comments about how expensive the medical care was, how much time Diane spent managing Autumn's appointments, how they'd had to withdraw Autumn from most of her classes because she couldn't handle the workload. Everything they said sounded reasonable on the surface, but my instincts screamed that I was being fed a carefully constructed lie. Autumn had never shown signs of depression or anxiety before. She'd been excited about starting college, about living near her favorite aunt and uncle, about finally having independence from her controlling father. That thought stopped me cold. Autumn's father, my Uncle Richard, had died 14 months ago in a car accident on his way home from work. He'd left everything to Autumn in his will, his life insurance payout, his retirement accounts, his house, everything totaling around $800,000. Autumn was only 19 when he died, which meant the estate was held in a trust managed by the executor until she turned 21. The executor was Gerald, my Uncle Richard's older brother, who sat across from me now explaining how expensive Autumn's medical care had been. I felt my stomach drop as pieces clicked into place. I asked casually who was paying for Autumn's medication and therapy appointments. Gerald said the trust was covering medical expenses, which was appropriate since Richard would have wanted his daughter to get proper care. He said this while maintaining eye contact, daring me to question his authority as executor. I stayed at their house for 3 hours that day, trying to spend time with Autumn despite Diane's obvious discomfort with my presence. Autumn remained on the couch the entire time, occasionally responding to direct questions with slurred single-word answers, mostly just staring at the television playing some home improvement show. When I asked what classes she was taking, she blinked slowly and said nothing. When I asked about her track running, she looked confused, as if she couldn't remember what track was. When I asked if she wanted to go for a walk outside, she shook her head slightly and closed her eyes. I took photos of her without Diane and Gerald noticing, documenting the dramatic physical transformation, the vacant expression, the way she couldn't stay alert for more than a few minutes at a time. Before I left, I hugged Autumn and whispered that I'd be back soon. She didn't respond, but her eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition, or might have been nothing. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing through possibilities. Depression medication could cause weight gain, but 80 pounds in 6 months seemed extreme. The level of sedation I'd witnessed seemed wrong for someone just dealing with anxiety and depression. Autumn had been practically catatonic, unable to hold a conversation or maintain focus, more drugged than depressed. And the timing was suspicious, her complete personality change coinciding perfectly with Gerald gaining control of her substantial inheritance. I called my mother from the road and tried to explain my concerns, but she dismissed them immediately. She said Diane and Gerald were good people who'd graciously taken Autumn in after Richard died, that mental health issues were complicated and I shouldn't judge, that families needed to support each other through difficult times. When I suggested maybe Autumn needed a second medical opinion, my mother got angry and told me to stop making trouble. That night I couldn't sleep, lying awake researching psychiatric medications and their side effects. I learned that certain antipsychotics and mood stabilizers could cause significant weight gain, but the level of sedation I'd witnessed suggested something more aggressive. I found articles about medication abuse in guardianship situations, about caretakers over-medicating vulnerable adults to keep them compliant and steal their assets. The pattern matched what I'd observed: the excessive drugging, the isolation from family members, the executor controlling finances while the beneficiary remained incapacitated. But I had no proof, just instinct and suspicion and a few photos of my heavily sedated cousin. I needed evidence before I could accuse Gerald and Diane of anything, needed documentation that would convince someone in authority to investigate. I decided to visit Autumn again, unannounced, armed with specific questions and my phone ready to record. 2 weeks later, I drove back to their house on a Wednesday afternoon when I knew Gerald would be at his law firm and Diane would be alone with Autumn. I brought flowers and a story about being in the neighborhood, acting casual and friendly. Diane answered the door looking surprised but let me in, clearly calculating whether refusing entry would seem suspicious. Autumn was in the same position on the couch, wearing different stained sweatpants but otherwise unchanged. I sat beside her and talked about neutral topics while Diane hovered nearby, then casually asked if I could see the medication list to better understand what Autumn was dealing with. Diane hesitated, then retrieved the pill organizer and a folder containing prescription bottles. I photographed every label while pretending to read sympathetically, capturing medication names, dosages, prescribing doctors, and pharmacy information. The list was extensive, at least 8 different medications, including 2 powerful antipsychotics, 3 benzodiazepines, and several other drugs I didn't recognize. While Diane went to the bathroom, I quickly asked Autumn if she wanted me to help her. She looked at me with those vacant eyes and whispered, "Can't think straight," before her head lolled back against the couch. I asked if she wanted to leave, to come stay with me, and she tried to form words but couldn't complete the sentence. She reached for my hand and squeezed weakly, and I saw tears forming in her unfocused eyes. Then Diane returned and I had to pull back, resume acting normally, pretend I hadn't just witnessed my cousin begging for rescue through her drugged haze. I stayed another hour making small talk, then left promising to visit again soon. In my car, I immediately emailed the medication photos to myself and started researching the prescribing doctors. Every prescription came from the same psychiatrist, a Dr. Nathan Voigt, who practiced in a small office 30 miles from Diane and Gerald's house. I called Dr. Voigt's office the next day, posing as a family member concerned about Autumn's medication regimen. The receptionist was polite but unhelpful, stating she couldn't discuss patient information without authorization. I asked if it was normal for someone to be on 8 simultaneous medications for depression and anxiety, and she said I'd need to speak with the doctor directly during an appointment. I made an appointment using a fake name, planning to show up and demand answers about why Autumn was being drugged into oblivion. But before that appointment arrived, I decided to consult someone with actual medical expertise. I contacted my former roommate Julia, who was completing her psychiatry residency at a teaching hospital in the city. I sent her the medication list without identifying Autumn, asking if this combination seemed appropriate for treating depression and anxiety in a 20-year-old woman. Julia called me within an hour, her voice tight with concern. She said the medication combination was extremely aggressive and highly unusual for someone with no history of severe mental illness. The 2 antipsychotics, Haldol and Thorazine, were typically reserved for acute psychotic episodes or severe schizophrenia, not depression or anxiety. The dosages were high enough to cause significant sedation, cognitive impairment, and rapid weight gain. Combined with 3 different benzodiazepines, the regimen would leave someone barely functional, unable to think clearly or advocate for themselves. Julia asked point blank if I suspected medication abuse, and I admitted my fears about Gerald using drugs to control Autumn while stealing her inheritance. Julia said I needed to report this immediately, that keeping someone incapacitated through excessive medication was both medical abuse and possibly criminal guardianship fraud. She offered to review medical records if I could obtain them and testify as an expert witness if needed. I spent the next week building a case. I visited the county courthouse and pulled documents related to Richard's estate and the trust administration. The paperwork showed Gerald had been making regular withdrawals for Autumn's living expenses, medical care, and educational costs, all reasonable on paper. But the amounts were suspiciously large, tens of thousands per month for someone supposedly living with family and barely attending school. I requested detailed accounting records, which required filing a formal petition as an interested family member. The clerk warned this would alert Gerald that someone was scrutinizing his financial management. I filed anyway, knowing I was about to make myself an enemy but no longer caring. Autumn needed rescue more than I needed family peace. Gerald called me that evening, his voice carefully controlled but radiating anger. He said he understood I was concerned about Autumn, but my courthouse visit was inappropriate and hurtful. He reminded me that he'd been appointed executor because Richard trusted him completely, that he'd managed the estate responsibly, that every expense was documented and necessary. He suggested my interference was making things harder for Autumn, who needed stability and support, not family drama. When I asked why Autumn was on such aggressive psychiatric medication, Gerald said that was between Autumn and her doctors, that medical privacy laws prevented him from discussing details, that I needed to respect boundaries. I asked when Autumn would be well enough to return to school or see other family members, and Gerald said her recovery timeline was uncertain, potentially years depending on how she responded to treatment, years of being drugged and isolated while Gerald depleted her inheritance. I told him I planned to visit Autumn regularly, and he said I was welcome anytime but shouldn't disrupt her routine or upset her with intrusive questions. The accounting records arrived 3 weeks later, and they confirmed my worst suspicions. Gerald had withdrawn over $150,000 in 14 months, claiming expenses for medical care, housing, food, transportation, and educational costs. But the documentation was vague and the amounts were absurdly inflated. He'd billed the trust $8,000 per month for Autumn's room and board despite her living in their house. He'd claimed medical expenses totaling $60,000 for appointments and medications that should have cost a fraction of that even without insurance. He'd withdrawn $15,000 for educational expenses despite Autumn attending barely any classes. The pattern was clear. Gerald was systematically looting Autumn's inheritance while keeping her too drugged to notice or object. I made copies of everything and contacted a trusts and estates attorney named Patricia Reeves who specialized in fiduciary abuse cases. Patricia reviewed the documents with increasing outrage, her professional composure cracking as she recognized the obvious fraud. She explained that executors were held to strict fiduciary standards and could be removed for self-dealing or failing to act in the beneficiary's interest. The inflated expense claims combined with Autumn's suspicious medical condition suggested a coordinated scheme to incapacitate the beneficiary and steal trust assets. Patricia said we needed to file an emergency petition to remove Gerald as executor and appoint a guardian ad litem to investigate Autumn's medical treatment. She warned the legal process would be ugly in public, that Gerald would fight aggressively to protect his access to the money, that our family would fracture over the accusations. I said I didn't care about family harmony when my cousin was being drugged and robbed. Patricia smiled grimly and said she'd prepare the paperwork immediately. We filed the emergency petition on a Friday morning, requesting the court remove Gerald as executor, freeze all trust assets, appoint an independent guardian, and order a comprehensive medical evaluation of Autumn by doctors not connected to Gerald or Diane. The petition detailed the excessive medication regimen, the suspicious expense claims, and Autumn's visible deterioration while under their care. Patricia argued that Autumn was in immediate danger of continued medical abuse and financial exploitation, requiring urgent intervention. The judge assigned to the case was Linda Ortega, known for taking elder abuse and guardianship fraud seriously. She scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Wednesday, ordered Gerald to appear with full accounting records, and issued a temporary restraining order preventing any further trust withdrawals without court approval. Patricia called to tell me the news, adding that Gerald was almost certainly hiring expensive lawyers right now and preparing to destroy our case. Gerald's lawyer filed a response on Monday painting me as a jealous relative, making baseless accusations against generous caretakers who'd sacrificed to help Autumn during mental health crisis. The response claimed Autumn's weight gain and sedation were unfortunate but necessary side effects of treating severe depression with suicidal ideation. It included a letter from Dr. Voigt stating Autumn's medication regimen was medically appropriate and carefully monitored. The response attacked my credibility, pointing out I had no medical expertise, hadn't lived near Autumn for years, and visited only occasionally. It characterized my concerns as misinformed meddling by someone who didn't understand psychiatric treatment. Gerald's lawyer demanded the court dismiss my petition, sanction me for making false allegations, and award attorney fees to Gerald for defending against frivolous litigation. Patricia read the response to me over the phone and said, "They're terrified. This is what guilty people sound like when cornered." The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Wednesday. Patricia subpoenaed Autumn to appear so the judge could observe her condition directly. She also subpoenaed Dr. Voigt to testify about the medical treatment and medication regimen. Tuesday night, Diane called me crying, begging me to drop the petition before I destroyed our family. She insisted they'd done nothing wrong, that Autumn was genuinely sick, that the medications were necessary, that I was being cruel and delusional. When I said I just wanted Autumn evaluated by independent doctors, Diane's tears stopped abruptly, and her voice went cold. She said I'd regret this, that I was making enemies of people who'd never forgive me, that some bridges couldn't be repaired once burned. I hung up without responding, hands shaking but resolve strengthened. People who were innocent didn't threaten family members for requesting medical evaluations. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold. I met Patricia at the courthouse at 1:30, watching lawyers and clients stream through security. Gerald arrived at 1:45 with his attorney, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who ignored me completely. Diane came 10 minutes later looking haggard and angry. At 1:55, a transport van pulled up and 2 attendants helped Autumn into a wheelchair. My heart stopped when I saw her. She'd gained more weight since my last visit, her face bloated almost beyond recognition, her body swollen and shapeless under a loose dress. She stared straight ahead with dead eyes, drool collecting at the corner of her mouth, completely unresponsive to her surroundings. The attendants wheeled her into the building and up to the courtroom, parking her wheelchair at the defense table next to Gerald's lawyer. She didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't react when Gerald touched her shoulder, didn't seem to know where she was or why. Judge Ortega entered promptly at 2 o'clock, took one look at Autumn slumped in the wheelchair, and her expression shifted from judicial neutrality to barely concealed shock. She asked Gerald's lawyer if this was the young woman in question, and he confirmed it was. Judge Ortega asked Autumn directly if she understood why she was in court, and Autumn didn't respond at all. The judge repeated the question louder, and Autumn's head turned slightly, but her eyes didn't focus. Judge Ortega's jaw tightened and she said, "We're going to get to the bottom of this right now." She ordered bailiffs to arrange for immediate medical transport to the county hospital for comprehensive evaluation by the emergency medicine team and psychiatric consultants. Gerald's lawyer objected strenuously, arguing this violated Autumn's medical privacy and exceeded the court's authority. Judge Ortega cut him off, stating that when someone appeared before her court in this condition, she had both authority and obligation to ensure their welfare and determine if they could participate meaningfully in legal proceedings affecting their interests. Dr. Voigt testified next, and Patricia's cross-examination was surgical. She asked him to explain why Autumn required 2 different antipsychotic medications typically used for schizophrenia when her diagnosed condition was depression and anxiety. Dr. Voigt claimed she'd developed treatment-resistant depression with psychotic features requiring aggressive intervention. Patricia asked when Autumn had been hospitalized for psychosis, and Dr. Voigt admitted she hadn't been hospitalized, that outpatient treatment seemed sufficient. Patricia asked if he'd tried less sedating medications before prescribing Haldol and Thorazine at high doses, and Dr. Voigt said Autumn's uncle reported she was a danger to herself, requiring immediate aggressive treatment. Patricia then revealed she'd obtained Dr. Voigt's prescribing records through subpoena. In the past 5 years, he'd prescribed antipsychotics to 47 patients, and 43 of those patients were elderly individuals in guardianship situations or young adults whose finances were controlled by family members. The pattern suggested Dr. Voigt specialized in medicating people into compliance for caretakers who wanted them incapacitated. Dr. Voigt's face flushed red as Patricia walked through his prescribing history. She showed how his practice derived most of its income from a small number of families who brought multiple vulnerable relatives for treatment, how his medication regimens were consistently more aggressive than standard psychiatric practice, how several of his former patients had died from complications related to excessive medication. She asked if Gerald paid him in cash for Autumn's appointments, and Dr. Voigt confirmed cash payments totaling thousands of dollars. She asked if he'd performed baseline medical tests before prescribing, if he'd monitored Autumn for dangerous side effects, if he'd documented clinical justification for the aggressive medication combination. Dr. Voigt's answers became increasingly evasive. Judge Ortega interrupted to ask directly whether Dr. Voigt had concerns about prescribing this medication regimen to a previously healthy 20-year-old woman. Dr. Voigt said he'd relied on the family's reports of Autumn's mental state and trusted their assessment. Judge Ortega said that sounded like negligence at minimum and potentially criminal conspiracy. The hospital evaluation results arrived via fax during the hearing's afternoon session. The emergency medicine team reported Autumn was severely oversedated with dangerous levels of multiple psychiatric medications in her system. Her cognitive function was profoundly impaired. She showed signs of drug-induced Parkinsonism, her liver enzymes were elevated suggesting organ stress, and her vital signs indicated her body was struggling to process the chemical load. The psychiatric consultant found no evidence of underlying psychosis, schizophrenia, or severe mental illness that would justify the medication regimen. Autumn was able to communicate when the drugs began wearing off, stating she felt confused and trapped, that she didn't understand why she couldn't think clearly, that she wanted the medication to stop. The doctors recommended immediate discontinuation of all antipsychotics and benzodiazepines under medical supervision, with gradual tapering to prevent withdrawal seizures. They stated unequivocally that continuing the current medication regimen would cause permanent cognitive damage and potentially death. Judge Ortega ordered Autumn admitted to the county hospital immediately for medically supervised drug withdrawal and comprehensive evaluation. She removed Gerald as executor and trustee, appointing a professional fiduciary with no family connections to manage the estate. She froze all trust assets pending full accounting and investigation. She issued a restraining order prohibiting Gerald and Diane from contacting Autumn or interfering with her medical care. She referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation, citing probable cause for financial exploitation of a dependent adult, medical abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Gerald's lawyer argued these actions were excessive and prejudicial, that Gerald had acted in good faith based on medical advice. Judge Ortega said good faith didn't explain why Gerald had withdrawn $150,000 in 14 months while keeping Autumn drugged into oblivion. that the evidence suggested calculated exploitation, and that criminal prosecutors could determine whether charges were warranted. No, Gerald and Diane left the courthouse without speaking to anyone, Gerald's face red with suppressed rage, Diane crying into her hands. I stayed with Patricia while she coordinated with hospital administrators and the newly appointed fiduciary. The professional fiduciary, a woman named Karen Stoltz, had decades of experience managing complex estates and had worked on multiple fiduciary abuse cases. She promised to conduct a thorough audit of all trust transactions and recover any improperly withdrawn funds. She asked if I'd be willing to maintain contact with Autumn during her recovery, to serve as a family connection while she rebuilt her life. I agreed immediately, grateful someone was finally protecting my cousin after months of being drugged and stolen from. I visited Autumn in the hospital the next day. She was in a private room in the psychiatric unit, monitored constantly during the medication withdrawal process. She looked terrible, her body shaking from withdrawal symptoms, nausea making her vomit every few hours, anxiety spiking as the drugs left her system. But her eyes were clearer than I'd seen in months. She recognized me immediately and started crying, reaching for my hand and squeezing hard. She said she didn't understand what had happened to her, that one day she was fine and the next she felt like she was underwater, drowning in fog, unable to form thoughts or remember things. She remembered Gerald and Diane giving her pills every morning and night, remembered feeling increasingly tired and confused, remembered gaining weight rapidly but being unable to care about it or do anything to stop it. She said she'd tried to refuse the medication once and Gerald had threatened to have her committed to a psychiatric facility if she didn't cooperate with treatment. Over the next week, as the drugs gradually cleared from Autumn's system, her personality returned in pieces. She started speaking in complete sentences, asking questions about what had happened, remembering more details about the past 14 months. She described how Gerald had convinced her to move in with them after Richard died, promising to help her through grief and college transition. For the first few months, things seemed normal. Then Gerald started talking about how worried he was about her mental health, suggesting she seemed depressed and should see a therapist. When Autumn said she felt fine, Gerald insisted she was in denial about her grief, that Richard's death had traumatized her more than she realized. He scheduled the appointment with Dr. Voigt without asking, drove her there, sat in the waiting room while she met with the doctor. Dr. Voigt spent 15 minutes talking to her, then prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, saying it would help her process her loss more effectively. The medications made Autumn feel foggy and tired, but Gerald said that was normal initially. After a few weeks, Dr. Voigt increased the dosages and added new medications, saying Autumn wasn't responding adequately to treatment. Each appointment resulted in more pills, stronger doses, additional drugs to counteract side effects from the original medications. Autumn tried to object, saying the drugs made her feel worse, not better, but Gerald always overruled her concerns. He told Dr. Voigt that Autumn was resistant to treatment, that she had poor insight into her mental state, that she needed more aggressive intervention. Dr. Voigt wrote prescriptions accordingly. Within 4 months, Autumn was taking 8 different medications and could barely function. She dropped out of classes because she couldn't concentrate. She stopped running because the drugs made her exhausted and dizzy. She stopped calling friends because she couldn't follow conversations. She stayed on the couch all day watching television, too drugged to do anything else. Diane controlled when Autumn took her medication, standing over her while she swallowed pills morning and night. If Autumn tried to refuse, Diane called Gerald, who threatened her with psychiatric hospitalization or worse consequences. Autumn described feeling trapped and helpless, knowing something was deeply wrong but unable to think clearly enough to formulate an escape plan or call for help. She'd tried to reach out to me several times, but Diane monitored her phone and deleted messages before they sent. When I'd called, Diane answered and said Autumn was sleeping or busy. The isolation was complete and intentional. Gerald and Diane had systematically cut Autumn off from everyone who might notice her deterioration or question her treatment. They'd created a perfect scenario for exploitation, keeping her drugged and compliant while they drained her inheritance month by month. The district attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Rebecca Choi, who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse. She interviewed Autumn extensively, recording detailed statements about the forced medication, the threats of hospitalization, the progressive deterioration of her physical and mental condition. She subpoenaed Gerald's financial records, bank statements, credit card transactions, and trust accounting documents. What she found was damning. Gerald had withdrawn funds from Autumn's trust and deposited them into his personal accounts, sometimes within the same day. He'd used trust money to pay for luxury vacations, expensive car leases, renovations to his house, and private school tuition for his own children. The medical expenses he'd claimed were wildly inflated, bills for appointments that never happened, charges for medications that cost a fraction of what he'd withdrawn. In total, Gerald had stolen over $120,000 from Autumn's inheritance, leaving a paper trail that proved systematic theft. Rebecca charged Gerald with financial exploitation of a dependent adult, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft for forging Autumn's signature on trust documents, and felony theft. She charged Diane as an accomplice, arguing she'd actively participated in keeping Autumn drugged and isolated while Gerald stole her money. She also charged Dr. Voigt with medical fraud, prescribing unnecessary controlled substances, and conspiring to commit financial exploitation. All three were arrested on a Friday morning. Gerald pulled from his law office in handcuffs in front of his colleagues. Diane arrested at home while making breakfast. Dr. Voigt taken from his medical office mid-appointment. The media coverage was extensive. Local news outlets ran stories about a prominent attorney exploiting his dead brother's daughter, drugging her into oblivion to steal her inheritance. Public outrage was swift and intense. Gerald's law firm suspended him immediately, then forced him to resign when the evidence became public. His professional reputation, carefully built over 25 years, disintegrated within days. The state bar opened an ethics investigation that would likely result in disbarment. Diane lost her volunteer positions at charitable organizations she'd cultivated for social status. Their friends abandoned them. Their children faced bullying at school from classmates who'd seen news coverage. Gerald and Diane tried to defend themselves in the media, claiming misunderstanding and false accusations, but the evidence was overwhelming and their explanations sounded hollow. Dr. Voigt's medical license was suspended pending investigation, his practice immediately closed, his patients transferred to legitimate psychiatrists who were horrified by his prescribing patterns. Autumn's recovery was slow and difficult. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital as doctors carefully tapered the medications and addressed the physical damage they'd caused. She'd developed insulin resistance from the weight gain, early signs of metabolic syndrome, and fatty liver disease from the drug-induced metabolic disruption. Physical therapists worked with her to rebuild strength and endurance. Nutritionists helped her develop healthy eating patterns. Real therapists, not frauds paid by exploitative family members, helped her process the trauma of being drugged and controlled for over a year. She grieved for time lost, for trust destroyed, for family relationships permanently damaged. She'd believed Gerald and Diane loved her, that they'd taken her in out of generosity, that they wanted to help her through difficult times. Learning they'd viewed her as a resource to exploit, that every kindness had been calculated manipulation, shattered something fundamental in her worldview. I spent as much time with Autumn as possible during her hospital stay and recovery. She moved into my apartment when she was discharged, sharing my small space while she rebuilt her life. The professional fiduciary Karen worked with prosecutors to recover stolen funds from Gerald's accounts. She froze his assets, filed liens against his house and property, and clawed back as much money as possible. The process recovered about $85,000, not everything Gerald had stolen, but a significant portion. The trust had been depleted from $800,000 to around $600,000 after accounting for Gerald's theft and legitimate expenses. Karen managed the remaining funds carefully, paying for Autumn's medical care and living expenses while protecting the principal for her future. The criminal trial happened 10 months after the arrests. Gerald, Diane, and Dr. Voigt all faced multiple felony charges. Gerald's lawyer tried to argue he'd made accounting errors, that he'd intended to repay money he borrowed from the trust, that his actions weren't criminal theft but poor financial management. The prosecution presented bank records showing Gerald had withdrawn trust funds and spent them on personal luxuries with no intention of repayment. They showed forged documents with Autumn's signature authorizing withdrawals she never approved. They presented Autumn's testimony describing threats and coercion when she tried to refuse medication. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Ortega presided over sentencing. Autumn gave a victim impact statement, standing at the podium with her voice steady despite tears. She described losing a year of her life to drugs that nearly killed her, losing her father's inheritance that was supposed to secure her future, losing faith in family members she'd trusted completely. She explained how Gerald had exploited her grief and vulnerability for financial gain, how he'd turned her dead father's love into a resource to steal. She said she'd have to live with the physical damage from excessive medication and the psychological trauma of betrayal for the rest of her life. She ended by saying she forgave them because holding anger would only hurt her further, but she hoped the court would ensure they never had opportunity to exploit another vulnerable person. Judge Ortega sentenced Gerald to 8 years in state prison for financial exploitation and fraud. She sentenced Diane to 4 years for conspiracy and abuse of a dependent adult. She sentenced Dr. Voigt to 6 years for medical fraud and ordered permanent revocation of his medical license. The sentences were harsh but appropriate given the calculated nature of the crimes and the devastating impact on Autumn. Gerald's lawyer filed an appeal, but it was denied. Gerald would serve at least 85% of his sentence before parole eligibility. His children would grow up visiting their father in prison, living with the shame of what he'd done. Diane's children faced the same future. Dr. Voigt's medical career was over permanently, his professional legacy destroyed. Autumn returned to college the following fall, enrolling at a university near my apartment. She'd lost weight gradually through healthy eating and resumed running, her body slowly returning to its natural state as the medication damage healed. She changed her major to social work, wanting to help other vulnerable people avoid exploitation. She joined support groups for survivors of financial abuse and medical trauma. She testified before the state legislature about guardianship reform and the need for better oversight of executors and trustees managing assets for vulnerable beneficiaries. Her testimony helped pass new legislation requiring regular judicial review of guardianship arrangements and mandatory independent medical evaluations when medication regimens changed significantly. She turned her trauma into advocacy. 3 years after Gerald's arrest, Autumn graduated college with honors. I sat in the audience watching her walk across the stage, this time at a healthy weight, Clear-eyed and confident, transformed back into the person she'd been before drugs and exploitation nearly destroyed her. She'd rebuilt her life from devastation, survived calculated cruelty from family members who should have protected her, and emerged stronger than before. The inheritance that remained, managed carefully by Karen, provided security for Autumn's future. She used a portion to fund a scholarship for young people who'd survived familial exploitation, ensuring Richard's legacy would help others in his daughter's name. Karen eventually transferred management of the trust to Autumn when she turned 25, satisfied that she was capable and responsible, that the person Gerald had tried to incapacitate permanently was fully restored. Our extended family never recovered from the fracture. Gerald's conviction and imprisonment, Diane's obvious guilt, the public revelation of their crimes, created divisions that couldn't be repaired. Some relatives believed Autumn had overreacted, that family disputes should stay private, that sending Gerald and Diane to prison was excessive punishment. Others, once they understood the full extent of the abuse, were horrified and supportive. Family gatherings became impossible, alliances and resentments dividing people who'd once been close. My mother eventually apologized for dismissing my concerns initially, admitting she'd been wrong to prioritize family harmony over Autumn's welfare. But the apology came late, after the damage was done, and our relationship remained strained. I think about that October morning often, walking into Diane's living room and seeing Autumn transformed into something unrecognizable, drugged into oblivion while her inheritance disappeared. How easily it could have continued if I'd accepted the depression explanation and walked away. How close Gerald came to completely depleting Autumn's trust before she aged out of his control. How many months or years Autumn might have lost to unnecessary medication if I hadn't photographed the prescription bottles and consulted Julia. The system had failed Autumn completely. Her father's trust in Gerald was misplaced. Dr. Voigt's medical license allowed him to drug vulnerable people with impunity. No oversight mechanism caught the suspicious trust withdrawals or questioned Autumn's dramatic decline. She was saved only because I got suspicious, because I refused to accept convenient explanations, because I pursued evidence even when family members told me to stop causing trouble. That's not how systems should work, relying on individual family members to notice abuse and fight through institutions to stop it. But that's how it works too often, and Autumn was lucky I noticed before it was too late. The cousin who gained 80 pounds in 6 months wasn't suffering from depression or medication side effects. She was being systematically poisoned by family members who viewed her inheritance as their retirement fund. The weight gain was evidence of excessive medication used to keep her incapacitated while they stole everything her dead father left her. By the time I saw her on that couch, barely conscious and unresponsive, they'd nearly succeeded in their plan. But suspicion, documentation, and legal intervention stopped them. Gerald sits in prison now. Diane served her sentence and lives quietly in disgrace. Dr. Voight lost everything. Autumn survived and built a life worth living despite their attempts to destroy her. Sometimes that's the only justice possible, ensuring the person who was supposed to be destroyed thrives while their abusers face consequences. For Autumn, that was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.